This is Conversations on Careers and Professional Life, a podcast from the Foster School of Business, MBA Career Management Office. I'm your host, Gregory Heller. On each episode, I talk with guests from faculty and staff to students, alumni, and business leaders about the skills and strategies that can help you design a professional career that you're happy with. My guest today is Christopher Barnes, Professor of Management and Michael G. Foster Endowed Professor of Management at the Foster School of Business. Chris's recent research over the past few years focuses on sleep and its impact on work and the workplace. And not just the impacts you might expect or recognize in your own life. For example, how a poor night of sleep might decrease your productivity the next day, but bigger issues like ethics, decision-making, and workplace engagement. I've long wanted to have Professor Barnes on the podcast, somewhat selfishly because of my own interest in and challenges with sleep. In April, I invited him to present to faculty and staff as part of my work on the Health, Wellness, and Professional Development Committee at Foster, and after that, I knew I had to bring him and his research to my listeners. Christopher Barnes, welcome to Conversations on Careers and Professional Life.
Thanks. I'm happy to be here.
As I said in the intro, I've wanted to talk to you for a while. I've had challenges with sleep for many periods of my life, and especially since my son was born almost a decade ago.
Mm.
And that has caused me to go down a path of personal research and experimentation on sleep. I've read articles, I've listened to podcasts, watched YouTube videos of lectures, including your TEDx talk, and read books. I've changed my exercise, my meditation practices, adjusted my diet, given up caffeine for the most part, and tried various supplements and adjusted the typical sleep hygiene levers that I'm sure we'll get to talk about.
hmm
So I know why I'm interested in sleep, but I'd love to start by hearing what got you interested in studying sleep and its impacts on work.
Well, that came about from my previous career. So before I became an academic, I was actually in the United States Air Force. I was just a lieutenant for 4 years in the Air Force Research Laboratory, and I was in the fatigue countermeasures branch of the Air Force Research Laboratory. And so that part of the organization focuses on the fact that we have a lot of pilots and other aircrew members who fly extended missions, and they fly at times of the day in which normally people would be sleeping. And so there are a lot of issues around how do we have these pilots and other operators be effective in their missions when they are flying schedules that are really inconsistent with what we would usually look for as good healthy sleep. And so I just found that to be a fascinating topic. And I wanted to become a researcher myself and get into that world, but with more of a focus on the everyday person at work rather than the extreme context of a pilot who might be flying, say, a 50-hour mission. Not everyone experiences that level of sleep deprivation, I hope, but a lot of people experience much more chronic and realistic levels of chronic sleep restriction. So maybe people sleep 6 hours per night or 5 hours per night or something like that, and their sleep might go up and down over time in a way that can still have a meaningful impact on their lives at work. And so when I started my PhD in organizational behavior, I sat down to read the literature in that field on sleep, and that was a very fast literature search because basically that literature did not exist. And so I sort of made that my mission. I said, okay, sleep is something that really matters, and it should matter to everyday people at work. And so we need that research literature. And so I said, okay, that's the research that I'm going to focus on, starting my PhD program and continuing to this day, really.
There's been a lot written and talked about sleep, I think, especially more recently as we think about how digital devices, as well as the ability to time shift entertainment programming, has become part of our life. Have you looked specifically at how sleep has changed over time, just in the like in our lifetimes?
Yeah, there's an interesting set of research articles over the past decade or so that have tracked sleep systematically. So large scale, nationally representative studies, and then also some of these are done longitudinally. And so they show a very clear trend towards less sleep. I think the numbers I typically see are something like maybe 8 to 15 minutes of sleep less per decade for multiple decades in a row now. Um, so we don't know what people were sleeping like, say, 80 years ago, as accurately as we know about, say, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. But there is this clear indication in the evidence that we do have that people are sleeping less over time. And there are potentially many reasons for that. Some of this is the electronics that you're talking about, and they are more pervasive in our lives, which also has an effect on our sleep. And maybe more pressure to work longer hours, and maybe where we used to be able to get by on one 40-hour a week job to support a whole family. Maybe that's not the case now for a lot of people. So for a lot of reasons, it seems like sleep is becoming more scarce as time goes on. And this seems especially clear in the United States, but this is not the only country where that trend is emerging. So it seems like a global trend towards sleeping less, where society is making sleep a lower priority than a lot of other activities.
And some of your research has looked at how the workplace or the influence of leaders in the workplace has influenced how much the people under them sleep. Do you think that there's a society-wide aspect to that? Sort of like lionizing some of these, I'll sleep when I die kind of entrepreneurial people that then spreads throughout the culture?
Yes, I think leadership and culture are an important part of this. And so we can look at people who are large scale role models. So there are examples of famous CEOs who brag about how little they sleep. So some classic examples there are Jeffrey Immelt, who was CEO of GE for quite a while. Martha Stewart also made similar claims about sleeping like 4 hours per night. Donald Trump made such claims and talked about how can you outcompete me when I'm working more than you and I'm sleeping less than you. And so we get people who are very influential in the culture who make these claims, and they are also role models in their own organizations. And so they help shape their culture for their own companies, and that trickles down. And so we see in some of my research, looking at lower level leaders, so maybe frontline managers, middle level managers, the way they talk about sleep, the way they role model sleep influences the sleep of their subordinates. So if you have a leader who talks about how sleep is not important and how it's a waste of time and how they're too important to waste their time sleeping, and you have these leaders who also will send emails at 2 in the morning, and they will expect a response at 2 in the morning, and if you don't respond to those emails at 2 in the morning, maybe the leader makes a little comment about it at work the next day, maybe in front of other people. So there's a little bit of shaming there. So those leaders who engage in those behaviors, where they role model a lack of sleep, and they also reward and punish in a way that trends towards less sleep, this influences the sleep of those subordinates. So we see that subordinates of those leaders tend to sleep worse. That's very clear in the data, and perhaps they sleep less, which is a little bit less clear. So these leaders are shaping the context for sleep in the workplace around them in a way that can harm the sleep of the subordinates. There's a separate set of papers conducted by other researchers that looks more on the positive side. So in that research, they look at leaders who talk about sleep positively. So this is sleep leadership. So these leaders might talk about how people will be at their best in the workplace if they get a good night of sleep. And are you getting enough sleep? And here's some ideas for how to sleep better. And we really want you to be at your best. So when leaders talk about sleep that way and enact a role model of sleeping well that way, then their subordinates sleep better. So it's amazing to me to see that there's this interpersonal effect where even outside of the context of work, what happens at work with regards to how leaders shape the culture of sleep, that influences the sleep that people get outside of work. And then that in turn influences the selves we bring to work after having been sleep deprived or getting a good night of sleep. So it all comes back full circle. But coming back to your main point, leaders play a key role in creating this context for good sleep or for bad sleep, and it pervades the culture.
Is most of the research on this, is it around self-reported sleep? I mean, because we don't know if uh, Donald Trump, for example, if he really sleeps 4 hours a night, right? He says he sleeps 4 hours a night. So are we typically relying upon people's self-reported sleep, or are we using other data that now is prevalent from wearables like Apple Watch or the Aura Ring or Whoop Band and things like that?
Yeah, so there's kind of a few different ways to answer that question. From a research perspective, researchers use multiple tools to measure people's sleep. And so I sometimes use self reports of sleep. I sometimes use actigraph watches to measure sleep, but there are other watches that similarly will measure sleep. And those devices have gotten pretty accurate. Sometimes I will manipulate people's sleep by depriving them of sleep in a laboratory study. Sometimes I use the daylight saving time natural quasi experiment. So there's that sleepy Monday once a year in the spring after we change the clocks
Maybe
forward.
not anymore. Right.
Yeah, we'll see how that goes. There's some places that are talking about changing that, including maybe even at the federal level here in the U.S. So from a research perspective, there are multiple ways to vector in on how much people are sleeping, and these methods generally tend to agree with each other, with maybe some differences here and there. But the correlations indicate that using any of these measures can potentially be useful, even though they each have their own flaws. So that's one way to answer this question, like how do researchers know how much people are sleeping? The other way to answer your question is if somebody makes a claim in the workplace about how little they sleep, how do the other people around them know that that's an accurate claim? So you don't get to look at the watch of the person talking about their sleep, right? So you just have to take their word for it. But sometimes there's some evidence to back up what they're saying, right? Maybe they sent an email at 2 or 3 in the morning and you can see the timestamp on that email and you can say, okay, well, they're talking about how little they sleep and there's some evidence here that backs that up. There are also some cues that we can see in people's bodies, in their faces, in their voices. There's some research to indicate that we have some ability to detect sleep deprivation in others. Certainly nowhere near perfect, but still a greater than random ability to detect how little someone has slept the previous night. And so we can sort of see this in people, but their claims are still powerful, even if the claim is inaccurate. Let's say someone is sleeping 8 hours per night and making sure they get their rest, but they want to seem like they're extra dedicated. They can
They're
go to work the
scheduling
next day.
scheduling the emails to go out at 2 a.m.
Absolutely. And so people kind of wear their sleep deprivation as a badge of honor. And so there is room for that kind of impression management. I actually have a project with some colleagues here at the University of Washington that we have not yet published, looking at how people talk about their sleep deprivation in front of others, and it can actually be a way to gain status. And this differs across men and women and how it gains people status. So for men, when they brag about their sleep deprivation, they are seen as strong. Like, wow, look how effective this person can be at work, despite the fact that they are sleep deprived. Like they're so strong, not even sleep deprivation can slow them down. So men can gain status that way. Women, when they brag about their sleep deprivation, it doesn't seem to give them status through that perception of strength. Instead, women who brag about sleep deprivation are seen as self sacrificing. And so, because they are willing to sacrifice their own wellness for the sake of the group, that gains them status as well. So, it's sort of the same outcome of higher status for both men and women. It's just through a different process. But to your point, people can make claims about their sleep deprivation, which may or may not be accurate, but which can shape the way that people see them for having made that claim. And that I think is interesting to me because my earlier research looking at how leaders shape the context for work says that when leaders are role models for bad sleep, this creates bad outcomes for their subordinates. And in one of my papers, we find that it actually results in unethical behavior of their subordinates as a more downstream outcome. So, bragging about your sleep deprivation is bad for your workplace. So, why do people still do this? Well, this still unpublished paper indicates that, well, one reason people might brag about their sleep deprivation is to gain status. So it might help themselves while hurting everyone else. So there's a lot of interesting social psychology and sociology around this topic about how do we manage impressions about sleep, how do we influence each other's sleep, how do we talk about sleep, and we're still in early days of this topic.
Does the reason for the sleep deprivation matter? Like if I say I only get 4 hours of sleep because always be hustling. I'm putting in that extra time. I'm running the analysis. I'm coming up with ideas. Or if it's like, yeah, I got 4 hours of sleep last night because my cat was jumping on me and my kid woke up 3 times. Like, does that influence? Do you look at how that influences people's perceptions of the person who is talking about their sleep deprivation?
So I can say probably yes. My guess is that the attributions that we make regarding why someone is sleep deprived probably influences the perceptions that we have about them due to their sleep deprivation. But we don't have any hard data behind that. Still, my guess is if you say you were up all night on the presentation, then you'll probably be seen as especially dedicated. But if you say you were up all night partying, maybe you don't get quite that same boost to your image.
Right. So let's talk about some of the negative effects of sleep deprivation at work. So you mentioned your research that points to unethical behavior. I alluded to just lower productivity. If you've had a bad night of sleep, typically you feel like, oh, it's harder to focus here. What are some of the other ones?
Well, I think we can start with the most obvious, which this is research that predates me and is a very large body of evidence to indicate that when people are sleep deprived, their health suffers in many different ways. Sleep deprivation is a risk factor for just about any health problem you can think of. The big ones: heart attacks, stroke, cancer, obesity, diabetes, the list goes on. So, sleep deprivation leads to health problems. Health problems lead to people being absent from work and leads to presenteeism, which is when their health is suffering, but they still show up to work, they still work, they're just not their best self. So that's already powerful that sleep deprivation leads to this absenteeism and presenteeism. Perhaps the most obvious. People probably don't need to listen to me to find that out. Where I think it gets a little bit more interesting and not quite as obvious is when we talk about things like unethical behavior. So a lot of times we think about ethics as, well, there are some good people and there are some bad people, and one is never the other. In reality, we find that people are dynamic, complex creatures, and the same person can be good or bad at different times. So, one predictor of whether or not you're going to be good in a given moment is your ability to resist temptations. So in the workplace, we face many temptations to behave unethically. So in one of the measures that I use, it has items like taking credit for other people's work or blaming other people for your mistakes, and a list of another three or four such items. And of course, there's obvious unethical things you can do at work, like steal or lie on an expense report or something like that. So, over the course of a workday, most of us face many opportunities to behave unethically, but we exert self control to resist those temptations. And that's good, those are successes. The problem is your ability to exert that self control is finite. And we find, actually, there's a larger literature on this as well, that when people are sleep deprived, their ability to exert self control suffers, is undermined. So you're less effective at exerting self control after a short night of sleep or after a poor night of sleep. So that's a problem with regards to unethical behavior. If you have a short night of sleep and your ability to exert self-control is worse, then when you face these temptations, you're more likely to cave to some of these temptations. So in one of my papers, we document a set of studies in which we find that sleep deprivation is an important predictor of unethical behavior. And one of these studies, we actually followed the same people over multiple days, and we found that the same person is more or less likely to behave unethically based in part on the sleep they had the night before. So this goes back to the idea that the same person can be good or bad. It's not just a between persons difference.
So it's not just about whether or not I can resist the temptation of the donut in the break room, but actually other things that may impact the work environment, my colleagues, and even the bottom line for the business.
Absolutely. Yeah, and we face many of these temptations. And so maybe you do resist that donut, but your day's not over yet. And some of those temptations can really harm people. So we want people to have the ability to resist those temptations. And I'm an optimist. I think that most of us are effective in resisting those temptations most of the time. But we start tilting those scales when we sleep deprive people or when people suffer poor quality sleep.
Is there a challenge here where the decision around sleep, so much of it's a personal decision. Am I going to watch that next episode of on Netflix, right? And then it affects the commons essentially at work. Is there Are there any interventions other than modeling good sleep that an organization can make or that our society should be thinking about making that can lead us on a path towards better sleep?
Yeah, definitely. So I think there's room for individuals to make better choices, and I think there's also room for organizations to do a better job of creating a context that is consistent with healthy sleep for their employees. So at the individual level, employees can enact um, better sleep hygiene, which is essentially choosing the right set of behaviors that are consistent with a good night of sleep. So a consistent pattern where you go to bed at the same time each night, even on the weekends. Maybe a few exceptions there, here and there, but the baseline should be same bedtime every night. Um,
And same wake time, right? Isn't that an important part of the equation as
yes,
well?
yeah, you want a stable sleep schedule so that you're not voluntarily inducing jet lag to yourself. We call that social jet lag. Avoiding caffeine within maybe 10 or 12 hours or more before bedtime, avoiding nicotine within a few hours of bedtime, avoiding alcohol within a few hours of bedtime, no activities in bed other than sleep and sex. So don't turn your bed into a home office and a home theater and a dining room and all those sorts of things. So we can ask people to understand how sleep hygiene works and then allow them to make good choices with regards to sleep hygiene. But I think it would be sad if that's the end of the story. And now we put all the responsibility onto individuals and say, okay, it's not the business of the firm how people sleep, because it is clear that work has an important effect on sleep. Some of this is about how much people work. So if you work them too much, then they are going to rob time from sleep in order to work more. Some of this is about when they work. So we know the circadian rhythm is set up such that there are certain hours of the day that are well suited for waking activity and certain hours of the day that are well suited for sleeping. And so once we go against this natural pattern, we create problems for that person, which results in health problems and bad work outcomes and lots of other things. So we can look for ways to align their work schedules with what their natural sleep schedule should be.
And people have there are changes in that circadian rhythm pattern based upon age. I know that you've talked about this and I've read about the fact that like teenagers that that rhythm shifts to a later rhythm than when you're a young child, and then usually it shifts back as people get older. But I know that in Daniel Pink's When, he writes about chronotype, and that some people, are larks, and some people are night owls, and some people are in between. So in the modern workplace, is there a way that we can help people a become aware of what their chronotype is, and then b structure their work schedule around their chronotype?
Yeah, so this is where flex time comes in. So the first part of your question is, can we help people become aware of what their chronotype is? And by chronotype, we mean stable individual differences in the natural timing of their sleep patterns, such that night owls are people who have a natural tendency to fall asleep late in the evening and wake up late in the morning or maybe even well into the day. And larks are on the opposite end. So larks tend to wake up very early and then also go to bed early. So it's actually pretty easy to know your chronotype. We see that there's a very high correlation between self-reports of chronotype and physiologically based measures of chronotype. If you think you're a night owl, you probably are a night owl. If you think you're a lark, you probably are a lark. So that part's easy. We don't even have to train people. They generally just know what their chronotype is. The second part, how do we align their chronotypes with their work schedules? That's where flex time can be really useful. The problem is we have stereotypes about chronotypes that can harm people, especially those who are night owls. Some colleagues and I published a paper a few years back about this bias with regards to how people use their flex time. So, for people who use their flex time to start their day early, those people are seen as high in conscientiousness and high performers. People who use their flex time to start their day late, they are seen as lower in conscientiousness and lower in performance. And this holds even when we hold constant the quantity of their work and the quality of their work. It's really just a manifestation of a stereotype that's sort of based on a saying that I remember hearing as a kid.
Yeah,
You've
it
probably
was
heard
already
this
going
too,
on in
right?
my head before you even mentioned it.
Which is early to bed, early to rise. What's the rest of it?
Makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise.
Right. And so we hear this our entire lives. And so that makes us think that those who get up early are those who are conscientious and they're the good ones. And so if people have flex time it's an awesome tool to help them align their work schedules with their chronotypes. But if we have social norms which essentially punish people for aligning their work schedules with a night owl chronotype, then we're really destroying the value of the tool, which could potentially solve this misalignment problem. Um,
I could also see a challenge if your boss is a night owl and is firing off those emails at 12:30, 1 a.m., and you're a lark, right? And you're getting up in the morning and seeing that you've got, this barrage of emails in your inbox from late at night. That's going to affect you based upon the other research that you've already talked about and that we've talked about here, right?
Yeah, yeah, and this gets kind of complicated. So first, let me give a little bit of credit to night owls. So in that study that we had about the stereotypes and the punishment of people using their flex time to start their day late, it's the bosses who are larks who hold these stereotypes most strongly and who are most likely to give poor evaluations to people who use flex time to start their day late. Bosses who are owls, they kind of get that there are different chronotypes and that that's not necessarily a problem, maybe because they're the ones who are on the punished side, so they're less willing to punish other people for that.
Well, and I wonder
Um,
if there's like a bias where there are more lark bosses because the system rewards larks. So all their career they've been rewarded for being a lark and now they're the boss, right? And the night owls have been selected out because they haven't
Perhaps
been judged as well.
I I don't think I've seen any hard data on that, but I think it's quite plausible. I do say that the world is kind of built for larks. If you're a lark, then you have some advantages there. That the preferred schedules tend to align better with your circadian process. So there are some other interpersonal effects here that are potentially interesting, and this research is very very new. So that we need some more data to be really confident about this. But with regards to say a misalignment in the boss's chronotype and the subordinate's chronotype, this can kind of work either way. So there can be some problems there when the boss really wants to get things going. Let's say it's a night owl boss, and they're expecting work to get moving at 10 p.m., right? Maybe they're especially alert and awake and effective then, and they're raring to go. And the subordinate is a lark, and they really need to be getting to bed, getting to sleep at that time. So this is potentially a problem. It's potentially a good thing if you treat it more like a relay race. And so there's work that can be tossed back and forth between the boss and the subordinate. And so the Lark subordinate can work on it early in the morning, make some progress, kick it up to boss to work on it in the evening, and the boss is at his or her best in the evening, and then the boss kicks it back to the subordinate by the time morning rolls around, and so the ball keeps moving by going back and forth. This is sort of analogous to something I've heard about with dolphins. So dolphins are mammals, and that means they must breathe air, but they live in the water all the time. And so they must sleep, they must be in the water, and they must breathe air. And so you wouldn't think those three things go together very well. But the solution that dolphins have found over evolutionary time is to sleep half of their brains at a time. So sort of half of their brain keeps them awake enough that they can go to the surface, get some air, and stay alive that way, and then they rest the other half of their brain. And so you can do that in a project team where some members are sleeping and some members are awake, and you keep the ball moving. And we actually do this in air crews. So if you've ever gone on a very long flight before, it's unlikely that there was one pilot flying the plane that whole time, right? They probably had some sort of a rotation. So you can do that with a boss and a subordinate as well, and having different chronotypes actually enables
I thought you were going to tell us how we could learn to sleep half of our brain at a time because I was getting really excited there.
that. Would
Um,
be fascinating. I would love to see that.
Yeah. So we've been talking about work, but we both work at the university and we work with students. So I'm wondering if you've looked at or have any thoughts on how the modern university experience, and for us we're also working with MBAs, so they're a little bit later in their age but and careers, how sleep impacts learning and how we can create an environment at the university where the expectation isn't pulling all-nighters to get that paper in and get all the work done and get everything done, right? If what we ultimately want, and I know you've said that you want our students to go out into the world and contribute to creating organizations that have sort of a better attitude towards sleep,
Hmm.
how can we create that better attitude towards sleep while they're here within the university?
Yeah, so I think part of this starts with students having a better understanding of how sleep helps them meet their goals of learning and succeeding in the classroom. So there's clear evidence on how sleep influences learning. So basically, the simplest way to think of this is you have short-term storage in your brain and you have long-term storage in your brain. So the hippocampus has a large role in the short-term storage, and then the cerebral cortex has a big role in the long-term storage. So in order to get information into the short-term storage in the hippocampus, you need a good night of sleep before you do the learning. So if you don't get a good night of sleep before the learning, not as much of that information makes it into short-term storage. So sleep well before you learn. But you're not done because now you need to migrate that information from the short term to the long term. And also, as you migrate it to the long term storage, you want it to be connected in a useful way to other bits of information. So we call that memory consolidation. So that memory consolidation process happens primarily while we are asleep. So you should, after you learn some new information, if you want to keep that in the long term and have it connected in a useful way, then you need to sleep well after you learn, the night after you learn something. So let's say there's some crucial information you need to learn for an exam. You need to sleep well the night before you learn that bit, and then you need to sleep well the night after you learn that bit. So this is inconsistent with the strategy of cramming the night before an exam. So if you're lucky, you might be able to cram the night before an exam and try to force fit some of that information into that hippocampus, into the short term storage, long enough to get it onto the exam. And then it's going to leak out and it doesn't make it into the long term storage because you don't sleep as well the next night, or you didn't have that memory consolidation process, which happens primarily while you are asleep. And so people talk about doing brain dump on an exam and then they're done with it. And so part of that is because of the sleep deprivation that they are inducing upon themselves. So education people, when they conduct their research, they say the best way to learn for the long term is to space out the learning in smaller bits over more days. So instead of doing a 20-hour straight session of trying to learn physics, do the same 20 hours over more days, and more of it will get into that short term storage and then make it to the long term storage and be more useful to the student, not only for passing that exam, but for building cumulative knowledge that will help them in future classes and in their future career as well. And if they do this, they can probably study fewer hours and get more of it, more value out of those hours. So this is consistent with what they want. I think just a lot of students don't fully appreciate that that's the path to get to their goal of having more success in the classroom. There's also research to indicate that they are better interpersonally after a good night of sleep. So, if they want to be more effective in the dating scene and at parties, they want to be more enjoyable, they want to have more fun at the party, they want to create more fun for others at the party, then being more effective interpersonally is a good path to get there. And sleep is a key ingredient for being able to do that well. So, if you want to be successful in the classroom, you should sleep well. If you want to be successful in the social environment, you should sleep well. So, if students understood this, I think they would do a better job of prioritizing sleep. And I think systematically as an institution, we could do a better job of structuring these environments, not only to provide that information to students, but also to try to make sure that the resources are there to help them get the sleep that they need. And so some of that is in how do we schedule classes? And that might mean not having too many early start classes. And some of this could also be about helping students who have sleep disorders get treatment for their sleep disorders. So this is something I talk about more in the context of work, and I've studied in the context of work, but it also applies to university environments as well. So insomnia is a very common sleep disorder. The prevalence studies on that indicate maybe 10 or 15% of us at any given time suffer from insomnia.
Right, and the clinical definition for insomnia is it's not a very high bar to meet. Actually, it's like a certain number of days of having interrupted sleep within a certain period of time. And I know that when I read that, I was like, oh, well, I actually I do have insomnia
Hmm.
if you
Hmm.
judge it that way. And there are some interesting I know there's some interesting treatments for insomnia. A lot of people think, okay, well, it's like sleeping pills, or I'm going to take melatonin or whatever. But there's much more effective than any of that is cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, and there are
That
some
is
easy resources to access around that.
Yeah, so the American Academy of Sleep Medicine, Sleep Research Society, these other professional societies of sleep experts, there's very clear consensus that the number one go-to tool for insomnia should be cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. It works really well. Historically, that meant like going to an expert and having face-to-face sessions, many face-to-face sessions. There are now online automated tools that people can go to get treatment for their insomnia, and you work through it over the course of a few months, a few hours here, a few hours there, and it can dramatically improve your sleep, not just in the short term, but there's research to indicate that these improvements in sleep can persist 6 months later, a year later, perhaps more than that. I haven't seen studies that look at greater than 1 year out, but it's a great investment of time. Usually these are not expensive to access. One that I used in my research called Sleepio, last I checked, it retails for like $300. That might be a lot to ask a student to pay out of pocket, but a lot of healthcare programs will cover these kinds of treatments. And I think it's not unreasonable to expect maybe a wellness program at work to cover that kind of treatment. With regards to work outcomes, I like to say that, look, if you can invest $300 into an employee to help treat their sleep and you get a better employee as a result, there's got to be really good return on investment on that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, $1 a day, right?
yeah, in one of my papers, we find that giving people who have insomnia treatment through cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia results in improvements in job satisfaction and self-control at work and mood at work and helping behavior at work, and also some decrease in negative behaviors at work. So you really do get a better employee out of that for a pretty small investment. Um,
So I'll put links to these resources in the show notes for anyone who's interested in following up on them. As we come towards the end of our time together today, I'm wondering if there are other interventions beyond the sleep hygiene that we've talked about, like not using the phone in bed or not using blue light devices within 2 hours of bedtime, let's say, and having the consistent bedtime and wake routines. Are there other practices that you would recommend students or employees think about bringing into their lives to improve their sleep and thus their performance at work?
Yeah, so finishing that thought on treatment for sleep disorders, there are a few especially prominent sleep disorders, and getting access to treatment for those can be huge. A lot of people, maybe they're not sleeping well and they don't realize why. If they can go get diagnosed and then get treatment, it can have huge benefits to their lives across lots of spheres, their interpersonal relationships, their work outcomes, their health. So that would be a huge one. You talked about sleep hygiene. And consistent with that general idea of managing blue light exposure, it really helps to get blue light exposure in the morning. So go maybe outside or at least be near a window in the morning. At night, you can limit that blue light a few different ways, maybe closing your windows, minimizing the number of lights on in your house, minimizing your use of electronic devices. Another way, I think I see where you're going with
Yeah.
that, is blue light filtering glasses. So I have a study on this showing that when employees wear blue light filtering glasses a few hours before bedtime, it can improve their sleep and improve their work outcomes as a result as well. The tricky part with the blue light filtering glasses is it's kind of the wild west out there right now for buying these glasses. There are many, many, many different ones you can find. Some of them make claims about their ability to filter blue light, which are not actually backed up by the data. So be a little bit careful about which glasses you use. The simplest, easiest test is put the glasses on, look at something blue. Does it look blue? If it looks blue, the glasses are probably not filtering out that blue light. So yeah, using glasses. The study I did with those used a set of glasses produced by Swanwick. Those I think retail for like $70. I'm sure there are cheaper models that are as effective that you can get much cheaper than $70. But even if you go with the expensive $70 model, that $70 investment is probably really good return on investment if you get a better employee as a result.
And
Um,
then I think the other thing there is it shouldn't be viewed also as like a free pass to have your face in your iPhone until the moment you close your eyes.
Yeah, so these glasses filter out the light which directly passes through the lenses. But not all of the light that is in your environment passes through the glasses before getting into your eyeball. So you still have to do your best to manage the environment around you to minimize that blue light as much as is reasonable. Ideally, that means not using smartphones at all after, like, I don't know, maybe 7 p.m. But I understand that the world that we live in, that's going to be a really hard rule to enact on a regular basis. So get as close to that as you can. Use blue light filtering glasses to get you a few steps further than that. And for all of these, you just have to use these choices as you best can given the demands of your life. And so that goes with your work schedules, with your blue light usage, um, and your bedtimes. Not everyone's going to go to bed at 10 p.m. exactly every night, and that's okay. We don't have to be perfect. We have to be willing to forgive ourselves when we don't get it quite right, but try to get back to a healthier baseline as best we can.
Are there any other tips or resources that you would like to share with folks listening to this podcast?
I think a few things that are worth noting. Number one is that I think we need to better appreciate that there's a bit of a quantity quality trade off in our waking hours. So you can always squeeze in a little bit more work if you want by stealing time from sleep. But the quality of that extra work from those extra hours is not going to be as high. So, in some contexts, when you're doing a very simple job that doesn't require a lot of cognitive input, there's not a lot of complexity there, doesn't require creativity, um, then maybe you're okay making that trade and you can work more hours and sleep less, and you'll be better off at work for doing so. But I think for most jobs, at least the ones that we tend to aspire to, quality matters and creativity matters, and doing your job well is more important than doing more of the job. So for those jobs, you're probably better off most of the time not sacrificing sleep in order to work more and not making your work of lower quality. So if we recognize that quantity quality trade off, it will help us make better choices about what is the priority of sleep. To go with that, I think it's important to realize that sleep makes everything else better. Everything else in your life, your health, your work, your relationships with your partners, romantic relationships, your friendships, everything else gets better when you get a good night of sleep because you're a better you when you get a good night of sleep. And so everyone else gets a better you when you get that good night of sleep. And so if you keep that in mind, that will also help you reprioritize sleep in your life. As far as resources, there's lots of good content out there on sleep. I think one of my favorite people for content would be Matt Walker. So he's got that very famous book, Why We Sleep, that is well grounded in the science, and has some good practical tips. He's also got a TED Talk that I think that's really good. Ariana Huffington has a book, that's about sleep. She has a few books. One of them is focused more on sleep than the others are, and I think that one's a little bit less directly tied to the science, but it's still generally consistent with what the science has to say, and so it's, I think, good from a non-professor type of author. So I think she does great work. She's a great advocate for sleep, and she also has, I think, a TED Talk that is at least partly about sleep. So those would be good resources to start with. And then, of course, I have some content that I'm proud of that is focused on sleep, especially in the context of work, which includes some content at Harvard Business Review. They have some online posts from me, and then an article there as well. And then you mentioned my TEDx. That was a lot of fun to do and encapsulate some of these ideas that we've been talking about.
Well, I'll make sure to put links to all of those in the show notes at conversationsoncareers.com, where you can find other episodes with some other Foster professors as well, but also the links to these resources on sleep. Professor Christopher Barnes, thank you for having this conversation on careers and professional life with me.
Yeah, it's been fun. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to Conversations on Careers and Professional Life. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider sharing it with a friend or classmate. Help others find the show by leaving a rating or review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Conversations on Careers and Professional Life is produced by me, Gregory Heller, with support from the Foster School of Business, Office of MBA Career Management. Learn more about the show, find show notes and past episodes, and get in touch with me at conversationsoncareers.com.